All right, so we are covering Judson today. I'll be with you next week. We're going to do somebody we've not done before. At least that's my plan. And then Ben Pinkston will be with you week 6. I'll be in Panama with Kenny and Cheryl. So you can miss a missionary class if you're going to visit missionaries. That's the rule. So Ben will finish. I won't tell you who Ben will do, but Ben will finish out week 6 with covering somebody else. So let's talk about the life of Judson. We're going to do Judson's a little bit differently. In the previous guys, we've sort of begun with an overview of their life and then sort of come back and hit different areas of who they were as a theologian, who they were as a missionary, who they were as a writer, and then talk to impact. I think Judson's life, there's enough twists and turns that it's really helpful. We can just follow sort of the contours of his life, and we can talk about some of those things as we go. Judson, like the other guys that we've talked about, his life was difficult and had a ton of suffering, and so we're going to see a lot of ways in which he persevered, he trusted the Lord, and endured throughout all those things. So let's just jump right in. Adoniram Judson was born August 9th, 1788 in Malden, Massachusetts, so we got an American. Died April 12th, 1850 on a ship on the Indian Ocean, and we'll talk about why he was on the ocean when he died and sort of how he gets there. Let's talk about his life. This is the house. So rather than putting up the text that's in your booklets, I've got some more pictures for you today. This is the house where Judson was born, or the home where he lived at. He was born to Adoniram Judson Sr. and Abigail Judson. His father was a Congregationalist pastor. Judson was a really, really bright child. His father was away on a trip when he was 3 years old, and his mother thought it would be fun to teach him the alphabet while his father was gone. And Judson ends up learning how to read as a 3-year-old while his father is gone. So his dad comes home, and at 3, Judson can read, which served him well. He began to read his father's library. He began to study theology. He began to read the scriptures. He was an incredibly, incredibly bright child. Does not come to faith. We'll talk about does not come to faith ultimately until much later in his life. So he's born in 1788. In 1804, on August 17th, he enters Providence College. At that time, it becomes later Brown University, but at that time it was Providence College. He was 17 years old. He finished his college in 3 years. He goes to school as a deist. His parents don't know that he's not a believer. He kind of tells them that he is, but he goes to school and really is a bit of an agnostic, and then meets a young man named Jacob Eames, who is a deist, and leads him really to deism. So would anybody know what is deism? When we say he was a deist in college, what does that mean?
He believes in God, but God is kind of out there outside the box, kind of not really sovereign as much as he is just kind of winding the clock up and letting things go.
Yeah, that's a great way to explain it. Some of the early American founders, not all of them, but some of them would describe themselves as deists. They believe there is a God, but that analogy is often one that they use, that God, like a watchmaker, he puts all the pieces together, he winds it up, and then he lets it go. And so God's not involved in the affairs of men. He's not reigning over the world in that way, that the world was put together like a watch. It was all the pieces, and all the pieces were put together, and then the watch was wound up and let go. So it's not agnosticism, it's not atheism. There is a belief in a higher power, but just not in a God that is involved in the life of humans, certainly not the God of the Bible. So he goes to school. He meets this young man named Jacob Eames. They become really good friends, and he has become settled in his deism as a result of his friend Jacob Eames. He graduates in 1807 with a BA, and he's valedictorian of his class. Again, super bright guy, able to finish in 3 years. He after leaving there, briefly runs a school in Plymouth that doesn't go super well. He does tell his parents after college that he's not a believer. He sort of breaks that to them. They believed he was a Christian, but he does tell them that he is not, that he's a deist. In 1808, he leaves August 15th for New York. He wants to write for the theater, right? So he wants to go to the big city. He's still trying to figure out what he wants to do in his life. He doesn't really know. And he describes his life. He lived a vagabond lifestyle. He sort of lived it up in the big city. And yet, as he lived there, he realized he was doing what he wanted to do, and yet he was deeply unsatisfied. He was not happy with his life. He goes to visit an uncle, and he stays with his uncle. His uncle was a Christian, was a godly man, and while on this trip, he ends up staying in a village inn in September of 1808. And when he checks into this inn, the innkeeper just warns him, "Hey, there is a man who's very sick in the room next to you. We're just really sorry for any disturbance that you might have." And so all throughout the night, he hears this man dying. He hears his groans. He hears him crying out in pain. And he listens throughout the night, and it's kept up, and is really bothered by the sounds of this man dying in the room next to him. And he begins to think a lot about death. He wakes up in the morning and goes to the innkeeper and says, how is the man? And he said, well, he died early this morning. And he says, well, who was it? And it turns out that it was his friend from college, Jacob Eames, the man who had led him into deism. And it really rocks Judson's world. As a deist, you weren't supposed to think about death. You weren't supposed to think about the afterlife. It's not really how your worldview functioned. And now learning that not only did he know the man who had suffered and died in the room next to him all night long, it was his good friend from college who had led him into deism. And so this is really the thing that leads Judson to begin to seriously consider and wrestle again with the gospel. He goes back to his parents, who are at this point living in Plymouth. And this is where he begins to really wrestle with the gospel. In October of 1808, he enters Andover Seminary in Boston. Now, he's still not a believer at this point. He's wrestling with the gospel, but he's not a Christian. He's not converted. He comes in as a special student, not a ministerial student. And then often he says that, no surprise here, he would take long walks in the woods to reflect and to think about the gospel and to think about life and to think about death. And then he writes in December 2nd of that year that he made a solemn dedication of himself to God. So he would say that December 2nd of that year, 1808, is when he actually came to faith. One thing that I think is interesting with almost all the guys that we've talked about, that most of them did not come to faith early in life. Most of them did not come to faith very quickly. That many of them wrestled deeply with the gospel for different reasons, right? So you think about a guy like Fuller. He wrestled with the gospel because of theological errors in the church that he was in. And you got to have a guy like Judson who wrestled with the gospel because of his own sin and the own things that he wanted to do. It is an encouragement. Maybe you've got kids or maybe you've got grandkids in your life who are wrestling with the gospel. And maybe you're discouraged that they're not yet Christians. Don't lose hope. Keep praying for them. Keep reaching them with the gospel. Keep pointing them to Jesus. Just because they haven't trusted Christ yet doesn't mean that they won't. That a lot of people come to faith in Christ after deep wrestling with the gospel. Some of you, I came to faith when I was 7 years old. I don't remember wrestling with the gospel much. But that may not be, I bet that's not the case for a lot of you here. But a lot of you here could point back to your life and say, yeah, I really wrestled. I ran from God for a long time. So this was Judson's testimony. He ran from God, and God used certainly the unsatisfying lifestyle that he lived, but the death of his friend to draw him in. He comes to faith December 2nd, 1808. In 1809, he joins his father's Congregationalist church, May 28th of 1809. He reads a sermon called "The Star in the East" by William Carey. It was about the gospel going to India. And he becomes burdened about unreached people groups and taking the gospel to places where it had yet to be named. He reads about Burma specifically, and he begins to be very burdened to take the gospel to Burma. So he begins pretty quickly after that, begins to make preparations to try to go overseas as a missionary. Now, he does write that he acknowledges that part of his desire, especially as a young man, to do missions was driven by the same attitude that he had before he was a Christian. He wanted to do big things. He moved to New York City. He moved to the big city. He wanted to write for theater. He wanted to do big things. And so now, after being a believer, now he's converted, he admits, I still really wanted to do big things. And to me, what would be bigger than going to the other side of the world to take the gospel somewhere? He wanted to have a big impact. That's part of what led him to go there. Now, I think you could look at that and say, well, that was a bad desire, right? That was a bad reason to want to go. Or you could look at that and say, yeah, God put Judson together in a particular way that he would have these desires to take big risks, to do big things. And then knowing that when he would bring him to faith, that he would use those desires and that appetite for risk to be able to fling Judson to the nations. But Judson is, especially as an older man, he writes and admits that part of what motivated him as a young man was to do something big. It wasn't always just the glory of God. He wanted to do something big. So he begins to try to prepare to go as a missionary. In 1810, February of 1810, he resolves to go to Burma as a missionary. He doesn't yet know how he's going to go, but he intends to go. And in May of 1810, he's licensed to preach, and he joins the Brethren movement of a guy named Samuel Mills from the Haystack Revival that happens at Williams College. Anybody familiar with the Haystack Revival? It's a really interesting sort of subplot of the Second Great Awakening about a revival that begins on a college campus and spreads to other college campuses. So coming out of that is what's called the Brethren movement. So he joins Samuel Mills, he joins those guys. And then June of 1810, Judson and 3 others go to a meeting of Congregationalists at Bradford, and they ask for missionary support. So these guys are determined to try to go to Burma. They go to this basically an associational meeting of the Congregationalists. They agree to send them, but they say, we can't send you yet. So they ask them to wait. We'll try to send you, but we can't do it yet. And it's at that time that he meets Ann Hasselton, who goes by Nancy. I couldn't find why. But he meets Ann Hasselton. Often in his writings, he calls her Nancy. She's 20 years old at the time, and he falls deeply in love with her. And what's great is we have letters that he writes to her, letters that he writes to her father as he wants to marry her before he goes onto the field. So he writes this letter to her father, and he's very, very upfront about what he expects his life to be as he wants to marry Anne. So he writes to her father. I think I've got a picture of her. This is Burma. You'll see. So Carrie's up in India. Burma's right over there. We'll come back to that map in a minute. This is Ann Judson. He writes to her father, I have now to ask whether you can consent to part with your daughter early next spring to see her no more in this world. Whether you can consent to her departure and her subjection to the hardships and sufferings of missionary life. Whether you can consent to her exposure to the dangers of the ocean and to fatal influence of the southern climate of India. To every kind of want and distress, to degradation, insult, persecution, and perhaps a violent death. I mean, he's really selling it here. Can you consent to all this for the sake of him who left his heavenly home and died for her and for you, and for the sake of perishing immortal souls, for the sake of Zion and the glory of God? Can you consent to all this in hope of soon meeting your daughter in the world of glory with a crown of righteousness brightened with acclamations of praise, which shall rebound to her Savior and heathen saved through her means from eternal woe and despair? That's how he writes to her father to say, I'd like to ask for her hand in marriage. He's very upfront about what might await her as they travel overseas. He writes this on New Year's Day in a letter to her. It is with the utmost sincerity and with my whole heart that I wish you, my love, a happy new year. May it be a year in which your walk will be close with God, your frame calm and serene, and the road that leads you to the Lamb marked with pure light. May it be a year in which you will have more largely the Spirit of Christ. Be raised above sublunary things and be willing to be disposed in the world just as God shall please. As every moment of the year will bring you nearer to the end of your pilgrimage, may it bring you nearer to God and find you more prepared to hail the messenger of death as a deliverer and a friend. And now, since I have begun to wish, I will go on. May this be the year in which you change your name. So, very forward. In which you will take a final leave of your relatives and native land, and in which you will cross the wide ocean, dwell on the other side of the world among a heathen people. What a great change this year probably affect in our lives. How very different will our situation and employment. If our lives are preserved and our attempt prospered, we shall next New Year's Day be in India, and perhaps wish each other a happy new year in the uncouth dialect of the Hindustan or Burma. We shall no more see our kind friends around us, or enjoy the conveniences of civilized life, or go to the house of God with those that keep the holy day. But swarthy countenances will everywhere meet our eye. The jargon of an unknown tongue will assail our ears, and we shall witness the assembling of the heathen to celebrate the worship of idol gods. We shall be weary of the world and wish for wings like a dove that we may fly away and rest. We shall probably experience seasons when we shall be exceedingly sorrowful, even unto death. We shall see many dreary, disconsolate hours and feel a sinking of spirits, anguish of mind, of which now we can form little conception. Oh, we shall wish to lie down and die. And that time may soon come. One of us may be unable to sustain the heat of the climate and the change of habits, and the other may say with literal truth over the grave, by foreign hands thy dying eyes were closed, by foreign hands thy decent limbs composed, by foreign hands thy humble grave adorned. But whether we shall be honored and mourned by strangers, God only knows. At least, either of us will be certain of one mourner. In view of such scenes, shall we not pray with earnestness, oh, for an overcoming faith. He's just as honest with her as he is with her father about what may await them. She writes in that same year to her friend Lydia, I feel willing and expect, if nothing in providence prevents, to spend my days in this world in heathen lands. Yes, Lydia, I have about come to the determination to give up all my comforts and enjoyments here, sacrifice my affections to my relative and friends, and go where God, in his providence, shall see fit to place me. She agrees to go with him. Again, this is, if you remember last week, we talked about Carrie. It's very different than Carrie and his wife. Carrie had to convince her and really talk her into going. She did not want to go from the very beginning. And it goes bad with her almost from the very beginning. You remember she loses her mind. They're going to suffer in a lot of the same ways that Carrie and his wives did. But Anne, Nancy, is on board. He was very frank with her. And he lays out all the possibilities. And even says in that letter we read, one of us may not make it a year in there. Right? We might go to India. One of us might die. But either way, we want the Lord to be glorified in us. She is all in. She determines to go. In September of that year, he graduates with an MA from Brown, and he later finished his studies at Andover. In 1811, he goes to meet with the London Missionary Society. It's a funny story. There's lots of stuff that happens to Judson. The Congregationalists had agreed to send him, but they said, wait, we're not ready to do it yet. He was impatient, so he gets on a ship to go to London to meet with Christians there to ask for support. His ship is taken over by the French, and he spent some time in a French prison, and then he happens to meet a guy from Pennsylvania who bribes a guard who lets him out of French prison. He's able ultimately to make it to London, and they say, no, sorry, we can't help you. And so then he gets back on a ship and comes back to America. So all of that really for nothing. All of that at the end of the day still doesn't get any help. So 1811. September 19th, 1811, he's appointed as a missionary to the East. A lot happens in a pretty quick time. He's appointed along with Samuel Newell, Samuel Knott, Gordon Hall, and Luther Rice. February 5th of that year, the next year, February 5th, 1812, he's married to Anne. She will only see her parents, I believe, one other time after this for the rest of her life. On the next day, on the 6th, February 6th, they're commissioned to go out as missionaries. And then on February 19th, this is the picture, or drawing rather, of their commissioning service. Again, I don't know why it's not going full screen. They leave on what's called a ship called the Caravan. They sail from Salem with, he goes with Anne and the Newell, Samuel Newell and his wife, and they put Samuel Knott, Gordon Hall, and Luther Rice on another ship. Why would they send them on two separate ships? In case one goes down, in case one sinks, in case one is overcome by a significant amount of sickness and everybody on the ship dies. If something were to happen to one ship, at least somebody makes it. So they go to Calcutta. That's the game plan is to go there to meet with Carrie, then go from India into Burma. The Samuel Newell and his wife, they die not long after they get to Calcutta. And then they had basically what happens, his wife is pregnant, gives birth. That child dies in labor. She dies not long after. And then we don't really know what happens to Samuel other than maybe just the weight of that sorrow. He dies not long after her death. So they don't make it very long in India. at all. On his way there, so remember, Carey is a Congregationalist, so think Anglican, right? Not a Baptist. He's a Paedo-Baptist. He knows he's coming to see Carey, and he's going to meet with Carey, and Carey is a Baptist. And so on his way there, just given how Judson's mind works, he determines, I'm going to study everything there is to learn in the New Testament about baptism so that when I meet Carey, I can at least carry on a conversation well. I want to be able to hold my own. He knows that Carey is a huge force of intellect, and so he wants to be able to argue his position well. And so he takes the New Testament and he studies everything you can know, you can read in the New Testament about baptism. Unlike anybody who does that honestly, he becomes a Baptist on the ship. He's got 4 months, and so he leaves a Congregationalist, and when he gets to India, he's a Baptist. And what happens next tells us a lot about Judson's character and his integrity. Remember, who sends him to India? Who's paying for him to go there? The Congregationalist. And now he's got a problem. He's landed in India, and he's there, but now he's not a Congregationalist anymore. Now he's a Baptist. When he gets there, he's baptized. Carey baptizes him. He writes back to the Congregationalist American Board, and he resigns from that board. He writes back to say, I've become a Baptist. My convictions have changed. He resigns from there. I said Carey baptizes him. A guy named William Ward baptizes him, who we'll talk about in a minute, helps to get him support for Baptists. So he does stay. But think about how easy it would have been to just say, well, maybe in a year or two I'll write them a letter and tell them that my convictions have changed. He's so troubled by the fact that his convictions have changed and he doesn't want to be dishonest with them. He writes to them and voluntarily says, hey, you might want to send a Congregationalist. I'm no longer that. I appreciate it. And then he doesn't take any more of their money. As far as we know, that was a sweet parting. Nobody was angry there. But again, it tells you a bit about his character and his integrity, that he wants to reach out quickly. So 1812, July 17th, 1812, he arrives in Calcutta. William Ward, an associate of Carey at that time, baptizes him. Between Ward and Carey, they write back to Baptist in both the States and in England and are able to get him support. Luther Rice gets sick almost immediately and ends up going back home. And part of what he does when he goes back home is to help raise support to support Carey on the field. In 1813, June 22nd of 1813, they set sail for Rangoon, Burma. So if you'll see, it is sort of right down here on the tip. That's where they're headed. That's where they intend to be. While they're on the way, Anne, his wife, goes into labor, and they lose their first child. That child died in childbirth. In all, they have 13 children together. In all, Carey has 13 children. Not all with Anne. 7 of those die in either infancy or early childhood. So same of what we've seen from a lot of the other guys. It was a really, really hard time, no matter where you lived in the world, to give birth and to try to raise children, but especially if you're in a climate that's as inhospitable as India. 13 children, 7 die in infancy or childhood, the first of which dies as they're on their way from India to Burma. They're on the ship. They arrive on July 13th. They join Felix Carey, who is William Carey's son. September 5th, 1815, they receive word of the forming of the American Baptist Board of Foreign Missions, and they officially appoint him as a missionary, and he serves with them for the rest of his life. September 11th, 1815 to May 4th, 1816, Roger Williams, his son, was born and then died. Lived not quite a year. This was, again, their second child, now second death. One died in childhood, one died after about 9 months. Anne writes of their son, Roger. Our hearts were bound up with this child. We felt he was our earthly all, our only source of innocent recreation in this heathen land. But God saw it was necessary to remind us of our error and to strip us of our only little all. Oh, may it not be in vain that he has done it. May we so improve that he will stay his hand and say, it is enough. So again, imagine how hard it is. You got a 4-month journey to India, and then a larger journey from India down to Burma. You lose your first child in childbirth, and then you lose your second child in less than a year. The weight of that was incredibly difficult on both of them, but especially on Anne. In 1816, he begins working on a Burmese translation. In 1816, he also composes a Burmese grammar, and a man named George Howe, who's a printer from America, comes to help him print. I think Christy probably talked to you some about this last week, that with Carey, if there was an error in Carey's translation method, is that he tried to do too many things at once. And he spread himself very thin. He worked in a lot of different areas, and so some of his stuff wasn't great. Judson was the opposite. He decided to hone in and to work and to create a grammar first, and then from that grammar to translate. I remember talking. If you guys remember Reeves, who was an intern here, I remember a few years ago talking to Reeves. He had ran into some Burmese. Anybody know what is the current country of Burma? Myanmar, right? So the borders are not the exact same, but it's roughly the same. To some Christians who were still using a Judson New Testament, that's how good his translation was. That for them it's kind of like the King James Version. That there are some smoother translations, but they really, really enjoy it. It's a faithful translation. So he worked very slowly. He composes a grammar. In 1817, he finishes a translation of Matthew. So he begins in 1816. And over a year, all he gets is Matthew's gospel. That's because he's moving slowly, because he wants to be careful to translate in a way that is faithful and can be used for a long time. In 1818, more missionaries arrive. He begins to use, this is again I should have put this up. This is what a temple, a drawing of what a temple would look like in Burma at the time. This is his house in Burma. This is it says John. I'm assuming that is Gospel of John. I can't read that. This is a part of his translation that he works on. Beginning in 1818, he begins to teach at what's called Zayats. This is one that he taught at. It's still standing today. You can go see it. Obviously, it's been repaired and been upkept, so a lot of the stuff is probably not original, but it's still there in Burma. And this still happens in a lot of Eastern countries today. Essentially, it's just a little hut on the side of the road that travelers, as they're traveling, might pop in. And whatever religion is there, you would sort of stop in and hear their pitch, and they would talk to you about how they viewed the world. And so he says, hey, that's what everybody else is doing. I'm just going to set up a Zayat, and people will, rather than me having to go find people, if I set one of these up on the side of the road, they'll come to me. And so he sets one up, and he begins to teach. And in 1819, he baptizes his first convert. He sees 18 people come to Christ by 1822. So he has a good deal of success pretty early on. In 1821, Anne gets sick and ends up returning to the States for a little while. Judson doesn't hear from her for over 10 months. Now, again, by all accounts, they had a great marriage. He loved her very dearly. It's a 4-month trip that he has to send her there. And then any sort of correspondence that he would get from her would take a while to get back to him. So he puts her on a ship, and then for 10 months doesn't hear anything from her. Can you imagine? You don't know. Your wife is sick. You put her on a ship to go back to America, and you have no clue. Did the ship sink? Did she make it? Is she alive? Has she gotten better? He doesn't know. For 10 months, he doesn't hear anything. He doesn't hear anything from her. She eventually recovers and is able to come back. One of the large pieces of his ministry in Burma was a fight for religious liberty. He goes before the king in Ava to argue for religious liberty, to argue that people should be able to preach whatever gospel they believe, that they should he should be able to teach the scriptures without persecution. It doesn't go well for him, and he's ultimately imprisoned. Part of that is there's a war happening, and so the country becomes suspicious of foreigners in general, and a lot of foreigners who weren't local were put in prison. But him arguing for religious liberty certainly didn't help his case. He's put in prison in June 8th, 1823. He's arrested and put in what's called a death prison, first in Ava and then later moved. It's called a death prison for a reason. I'll show you some drawings. He was in a room that was essentially 40 feet by 30 feet in dimension and 5 feet tall, which is smaller than this room. 40 feet by 30 feet, only 5 feet tall. You want to guess how many people? I may have put this in your book. How many people are in that room? 100 people. in a 40-foot by 30-foot room that's only 5 foot tall. It was called a death room for a reason. They would throw all sorts of trash and refuse when they slaughtered animals. It would just be tossed in there. There was no cleaning it. So again, if you're stuck in a room with 100 people like that, there's human waste that's on the ground. So you can imagine in the heat, people are getting sick. If someone does die, they might eventually come and remove the body, but it might be days or weeks before they do that. So you're in there with human waste and human filth, with decomposing bodies. They would often take them out and march them. At one point, he was forced to march 8 miles barefoot on hot sand and gravel. You can imagine what that does to your feet. And then they stick you back in the death prison. Now that your feet are all cut up, and now you're standing in filth. So you can imagine all the things that happen to you. You can see, you can sort of see it in this picture. Sometimes so that they would not run away at night, they would tie their feet and then they would stick a pole through their feet, and then they would lift their feet up off the ground to where just their head was touching the ground, and they would be left like that all night. Again, the floor is filthy, and that was just so that they wouldn't run away. He spends 17 months in this death prison. At the time, his wife is pregnant, and is pregnant with their daughter Maria. She brings him food. She brings him clothes. She brings him a pillow that she had sewed in his Burmese translation of the New Testament so that he could use it. He shares the gospel to people. She does all this by bribing guards. Obviously, this was not technically allowed, but she bribes guards to let her bring things to him. Their daughter Maria was born on January 26, 1825, while Judson is still in prison. She, at this time, was also caring for 2 Burmese orphans while her husband's in prison in a foreign country. She, not surprisingly, gets sick not long after Maria was born, so sick that she can't nurse Maria. And so Judson's in prison. She has this new infant. She's taking care of Burmese orphans, and she can't nurse. She can't take care of her infant. You can't go to the store and buy formula. She's got to figure out a way to keep her child alive. So she goes to the prison every night, and she bribes the guards, and the guards allow Judson in his shackles, essentially out of the prison for a few hours, and he would wander the village every night looking for a woman who would nurse his daughter so that she could stay alive. I can't imagine many of us would stay after that. It's incredible suffering. He says to another prisoner at one point, "It is possible my life will be spared. If so, with what ardor shall I pursue my work? If not, his will be done. The door will be open for others who would do the work better." Either way, if I live, I'm going to work hard, and if I die, others will come after me that will do the work better than I. Incredible amount of suffering while he's in prison. November 1825, he is eventually released, and he's allowed to go to a place called the Amherst Settlement. On October 24th of 1826, at 37 years old, Anne dies. She never fully recovers from the strain that his imprisonment put on her, and she never got better. She got sick after Maria was born, never fully recovers, and then dies not long after he gets out of prison at only 37 years old. He's actually traveling. He's not home when she dies, and he gets a letter to inform him of Anne's death that says, "My dear sir, to one who has suffered so much with such exemplary fortitude, there needs but little preface to tell a tale of distress. It was cruel indeed to torture you with doubt and suspense. To sum up the unhappy tidings in a few words, Mrs. Judson is dead." And that's how he finds out that she has passed away. And his daughter, that was born while he was in prison, Maria, ends up dying 6 months later at 2 years old. And then not long after that, she dies in April of 1827. And in July of 1827, he gets word from home that his father has died. So now he's lost several children in infancy. He's lost his wife. He's lost Maria. And he gets word that his father has died. And this sends him into a really dark season of depression. And I think most of us could understand that. You understand all the suffering and the weight that he was on. And this becomes the darkest season of his life. Excuse me. In 1827, After receiving word in July of the death of his father, he moves into a hut in the jungle. He moves out into the jungle, rather, and then in October of 1828 is when he actually builds the hut, but he lives in the jungle for a while. He quits working on his Old Testament translation. He destroys all of his letters of commendation, not condemnation. He destroys his letters of commendation. Those would be his letters from his supporters back in the States saying, this is officially our guy, we support him, we vouch for him. He destroys all of those. He'd been given at this point an honorary doctorate from Brown. He renounces it. He writes to them to say, please remove it from my name. He gives away all of his personal wealth. He reduces his salary from his support by 25%. And mind you, he didn't have enough to live on to begin with, and he reduces his salary even more. He digs a grave in the jungle by his hut, and then he spends his days sitting by that grave, just in a deep, deep despair, not just contemplating death, but really rather wishing for death. You don't dig your own grave and sit in that grave every day if you don't want to die, and he wanted to die. He didn't want to go home. He wanted to die. He was tired of life. He writes, my tears flow at the same time over the forsaken grave of my dear love and over the loathsome sepulcher of my own heart. And on the anniversary of Anne's death, he wrote, God is to me the great unknown. I believe in him, but I find him not. It is hopefully not hard for you to sympathize and to empathize with his suffering and his despair. This is a really, really hard point in his life, which he despairs of life itself. At one point, he goes even deeper into the jungle, so he leaves his hut and the grave that he's dug, and he goes even deeper into the jungle, presumably that he might die. You're not going out into the woods of Franklin County. These are the deep jungles of Burma, right? There's lions and tigers and bears, and there's all sorts of things that can kill you, all sorts of diseases, and he goes out there, presumably that something would happen to him and he would die. He doesn't seem to want to take his life, but he's not doing much to preserve it. He eventually comes out of the jungle, and then May of 1829, he hears word that in May of 1829, his brother dies. He finally receives word in December of 1829, and for whatever reason, this is the turning point from him. You would think the receiving word of his brother's death might make things worse. But when he left, his brother was not a believer. And not only does he learn that his brother died, but he learns that his brother died having trusted Christ, that his brother had come to faith. And it begins to lift the fog for him, that God uses that little bit of hope that his brother had trusted Christ before his death to begin to sort of to build him back. He spends most of 1830 coming out of the darkness, most sort of coming out of this fog that's been over him. And then, as God often does, he sees in 1831 the greatest growth in all of his ministry comes after this great season of despair and depression, of despairing of life itself, is when the greatest fruitfulness comes in his ministry. He writes of this new spirit in the land. The spirit of inquiry is spreading everywhere through the whole length and breadth of the land. We have distributed nearly 10,000 tracts, giving to none but those who ask. I presume there have been 6,000 applications at the house, meaning people asking to come and meet with him. Some come 2 or 3 months' journey from the borders of Siam and China. Sir, we hear that there is an eternal hell. We are afraid of us. Do give us a writing that will tell us how to escape it. Others from the frontiers of Cathay, 100 miles north of Ava. Sir, we have seen a writing that tells us about an eternal God. Are you the man that gives away such writings? If so, pray give us one, for we want to know the truth before we die. And others from the interior of the country where the name of Jesus is little known. Are you Jesus Christ, man? Give us a writing that tells us about Jesus Christ. So coming out of this despair, he begins to see great fruitfulness. People come to him. There's this great story that happens among a particular people group called the Karen people group that were at the time incredibly unreached, had no gospel presence. It's just really a phenomenal way the Lord works this out. A fellow missionary purchases at a slave auction a Karen slave with the intention to set him free. So he purchases this slave, he sets him free, and this slave comes to work essentially as an administrator, work for Carrie, and Carrie pays him. And while he's working for Carrie, he ultimately comes to faith and becomes a believer. And he says to him, "You have to go back to my people. We need to take the gospel to my people." And so this now freed slave who works for Carrie, who is from the Karen people group himself, takes Carrie back. The Karen people group themselves have a really interesting sort of origin story for how they think the world began. Again, unreached peoples don't have the Bible, don't have the scriptures in their language. And their origin story says there was a God who made all things. And this God made man. And then this God made woman from man's rib. And then this man and woman had two sons. One light-skinned son and one dark-skinned son. And God gave a book of life to each son that would teach them how to be saved. And that the dark-skinned son lost his book of life. And so as a people group, they have for years been looking for a light-skinned brother who would come and bring them a book of life to tell them how to be saved. And so this freed Karen brings Carrie back to them and says, here's the light-skinned brother who has the book of life. And what happens? They receive him. And this is the very thing that they've been looking for, and there is great fruit. There are today about 150,000. It's a small people group, but there are today about 150,000 Karen Christians that are here downstream from the work that God does through Judson and reaching them. Again, God teed it up for them. They were waiting for him to come, and it comes through the way the Lord just works that out. So he comes, and a huge number of them come to faith. And again, there's still a tradition of Christians in that people group today. They are no longer unreached because of the work of Judson and this fellow worker. In all this, he returns to his translation work. He returns to his evangelism. A man named George and Sarah Broadman, they come to help. They establish a mission center in British-controlled territory. Not long after that, Sarah's husband George dies of TB in 1831. And then ultimately, Judson would marry his widow, Sarah Broadman. He marries her in 1834, April 10th of 1834. He marries, again, her name is Sarah Broadman, becomes Sarah Judson. They have 8 children together. 3 of those children die in childhood. In 1841, their son Luther dies as a stillborn. In 1841, later in that year, at the end of the year, their son Henry dies as a 1-year-old. And then in 1845, they head to America because of her health. They leave their 3 youngest behind and take their 3 oldest children with them, with the intention of establishing their three oldest in America, leaving them there in the States. And they leave their youngest behind, which it would be so hard to do. Again, on why they made that decision, I don't know why they didn't just bring them all with them. Again, you think making that journey across the ocean all the way to America is an incredibly dangerous thing, so they must have judged it of a greater risk to bring the children with them than to leave them. They leave their 3 youngest behind, and their son Charlie dies. He's 1 year old. He dies before Judson comes back. And then I say Anne there, but this is Sarah, not Anne. His wife, your book I think says Anne. It's not Anne, it's Sarah. As they're coming around the tip of Africa, Sarah is sick and she dies on the ship near a place called St. Helena Island in September of 1845. What we find out is that ultimately Sarah dies about the same time that Charlie is dying in Burma. They die pretty close together. At this point, he does not know Charlie's dead. Again, he's on a ship on his way to America. He doesn't know he's lost his son. And now on the way to America, he loses his wife. He writes of her, on the evening of August 31st, she appeared to be drawing near to the end of her pilgrimage. The children took leave of her and retired to rest, and I sat alone to the side of her bed during the hours of the night, endeavoring to administer relief to the distressed body and consolation to the departing soul. At 2 o'clock in the morning, wishing to obtain one more token of recognition, I roused her attention and said, "Do you still love the Savior?" "Oh, yes," she replied. "I ever loved the Lord Jesus Christ." I said again, "Do you still love me?" And she replied in the affirmative by a peculiar expression of her own. I find it interesting there, he doesn't tell us what she says. That's just for him, I guess. He keeps that to himself. But she says yes with a peculiar expression of her own. He doesn't say what that is. Then give me one more kiss. And we exchanged that token of love for the last time. Another hour passed, and life continued to recede, and she ceased to breathe. For a moment I traced her upward flight and thought of the wonders which were opening to her view. I then closed her flightless eyes, dressed her for the last time in the drapery of death, and being quite exhausted with many sleepless nights, I threw myself down and slept. And again, they're still a ways off. They're just coming around the tip of Africa. They're still a ways off from America. 1845, he arrives in America. He's hailed as a hero. So, again, you just think time-wise. In 1845, what church has been meeting for almost 30 years? Buck Run has been meeting in 1845 as a church for almost 30 years. It is highly likely that members of Buck Run would have been aware of and known of Judson. He didn't come here. He wasn't in Kentucky. But he was really well known. He was hailed as a hero. He was serving in a far-flung part of the world. Baptists in the States were supporting him. It seems near impossible to me that the members of Buck Run would not have been aware of Judson and would not have read some of his writings and at least been aware of what he was doing. That has nothing to do with Judson's life. I think it's just interesting to think this body was in existence and would have been aware of Judson in his own time. So he comes home. He's hailed as a hero. He leaves his 3 oldest children there, Adoniram, Elnath, and Abby. He leaves them here. While he's here, it's a bit of a scandal. He's looking for someone to write a memoir about his wife. And he meets a young fiction author named Emily Chubbuck. At this time, fiction was sort of seen as a scandalous thing. It wasn't seen as serious writing. So not only is she a fiction writer, she's about half his age. He's in his 50s and she's in her late 20s. And so the fact that he meets her, they begin this relationship, and then they marry on June 2nd, 1846. Nobody's angry with him, but everybody's kind of scratching their head. It's like, it's a bit of a scandalous thing, right? It's just like if Ruth had died and he comes home and then he marries somebody half his age. Everybody would be saying, like, I don't know, Billy. Are you sure that was the great idea? This is what happens to Judson. His wife dies on the ship. He comes home. He meets Emily Chubbuck. He marries her. And then she goes back with him to Burma. By all accounts, she was a faithful wife. She loved him well. She served him well. As far as we know, nothing untoward there. It was a faithful marriage. I think the Lord knew he needed a support. He needed a wife with him. And so they go back. 1846 to 1850, they spend their last years in Burma. He spends much of his time in these last years working on a Burmese English dictionary, which again is still used today to help translate from Burmese into English. He develops a lung disease in these last few years. And if you read much of the writings of folks in this era, especially when you have a lung disease, when you have problems breathing, what do they tell you to do? Go get some fresh air. Get out of the city. Go get some fresh air. Spurgeon did this a ton. He would go out to the countryside. You can't really do that in India, so where do you go? You go onto a ship. And so he goes out onto a ship to take a voyage, to get some fresh air, to get some sea air, to try to improve his lungs. He dies while he's on board of that ship, April 12th, 1850. He dies on the ship while out in the Indian Ocean. One of his last words were, "How few there are who die so hard." So he did not have an easy death. He died in great pain. We do know a lot of the details. He died at 4:15 on Friday afternoon, April 12th, 1850. We know his exact coordinates, 13 degrees north, 93 degrees east. The crew gathered together. They put his body in a coffin, and they slid his coffin off into the sea. And that's the end of Judson. It is a reminder that we should all be so lucky to preach the gospel, die, and be forgotten. A man who saw so many people come to faith, who had such a huge impact. And how does his life end? Basically alone on a ship in the middle of the ocean. And what funeral? He doesn't get a big stately funeral. He doesn't lie in the rotunda. He doesn't have millions of people coming to mourn his body. How does he die? With some sailors of the crew of a ship, saying a prayer and sliding his coffin off into the ocean. And that's it. And that's where Judson's body lies. 10 days later, his wife Emily gives birth to their second child, Charles, who dies at birth. She learns of Judson's death 4 months later in August. Again, you can't call home. It takes a while for word to reach her. She returns to New York and dies of tuberculosis 3 years later at the age of 37. TB that she probably got while in India, most likely, that she contracted while she was there. Let's talk a bit about final impact. In his own ministry, not ministry that came after him, but in his own ministry, Judson saw over 7,000 people baptized. Saw over 7,000 converts. He planted 63 congregations. We mentioned earlier the Karen people group. Today there are over 150,000 Christians among the Karens. Burmese Christians now, there are about 3,700 congregations, over 500,000 members, over 1.9 million affiliates, meaning people who aren't members but who attend those churches regularly. That's talking present day. All of these things exist because of men like, he wasn't the only missionary, but because of men like Judson, who went to a hard place to plant gospel seeds that in the years after his life have continued to bear great fruit. I think about what Jesus says in John 12. Truly, truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Whoever loves his life loses it, and whoever hates his life in this world will keep it for eternal life. If anyone serves me, he must follow me, and where I am, there my servant will be also. If anyone serves me, the Father will honor him. What we have in Judson's life is a seed that fell to the ground and died, that it might bear much fruit. He suffered greatly. He gives up his life for the sake of the gospel. He saw a lot of fruit in his life, but the fruit that came after him far outweighs the fruit that he saw in his own life. He wrote, if I had not felt certain that every additional trial was ordered by infinite love and mercy, I could not have survived my accumulated suffering. So why is it that he's able to survive under the weight of all that suffering? Because he trusts in the loving providence of God. He believes that every additional trial was ordered by infinite love and mercy, that he trusts the heart of God, even when he doesn't understand, and that's why he says he's able to survive the accumulated suffering. Judson writes to a missionary candidate in 1832. This is a great recruiting pitch to get new people to come. Remember, a large portion of those who come out on a mission to the east die within 5 years after leaving their native land. Walk softly, therefore. Death is narrowly watching your steps. And it was true. Many of the people who left either America or left England or left even other parts of Europe to come to the east, whether that's Burma or India or China, many of them died within the first 5 years from illness, from climate, from all sorts of things. Some of them didn't make it there. Again, we saw even some of the folks, the Newells who came with him, they died within a year of being in India. Most people who came to India died within 5 years of being there. And so he writes, you can appreciate that Judson was never sugarcoating it. He's always going to tell you exactly this is what you can expect. And so he writes to this candidate, death is watching you closely. So if you come, just know you're probably going to die, which is an incredible way to sort of pitch that to somebody. But yet what we know is that like the guys we've talked about before him, like Carey and like Fuller and Brainerd, had a tremendous impact on many people who've come after him. If you talk to missionaries around the world today, so many of them will point to Judson's life as a reason why the Lord, at least one of the reasons the Lord used to call them into the field.